So it's wonderful to welcome you, Amanda, to our second session of Global Questions, which was kicked off by Sunil Amrit on the 27th of September. And thank you so much for coming all the way from Oxford University, where you're Associate Professor in History at St Catherine's College. We're here today to talk about your new book project, Medieval Histories of the Anthropocene, which explores questions concerning the relations between religion, power, and the construction of public rationality in the building of medieval states across Eurasia. So to start straight off, what is meant by the histories of the Anthropocene? And I think it would be helpful to go into this term a little bit, because I'm not sure if all historians are already familiar with it.
Certainly. So the idea of the Anthropocene is one that comes from geologists who have been thinking about different planetary geological eras, and at the moment we're in the Holocene, or we have been in the Holocene. The Anthropocene is as an idea about how to describe what happens next. So the Anthropocene is named for the time when human activities begin to influence Earth systems to the point where it leaves a discernible geological marker. There's a working group on the Anthropocene, and they looked at various different geological markers, and they looked right back to first human uses of fire, which are discernible, and went right through to about the 1950s, where they thought that the markers of nuclear testing, which also will be in the planetary record for a long time to come, might be the end of it. But so they decided that the Anthropocene should officially start in the 1950s. They still have to decide whether that has happened, but that's the idea. So a lot of toing and froing on this from a sort of physical science, geological perspective, but humanities people have taken this in a much looser way and have used it to talk about the era where humans and human activities dominate Earth systems and ecologies, and certain types of activity, I guess, dominate human societies as well. So that's how I'm using the term when I'm trying to write its history.
So it's interesting also that we can look at various moments in history where this period of the Anthropocene might have begun. It can be the 1950s, but I'm sure, and we'll get back to that later, we can also perhaps identify other earlier periods. This is all up for discussion. So we'll get back to how they've landed at the 1950s in a moment. But first of all, I'd just like to ask a few questions a bit more about your own background, because it's fascinating, I think, how you've moved from work in the field of medieval intellectual history, in particular on the Franciscans and on Roger Bacon, who we could consider to be a sort of hardcore intellectual working at the sort of in the beginnings of the institutions, to this hot topic of the Anthropocene. So I'm curious to hear how you think these two fields, Roger Bacon and the Anthropocene, are related. And how perhaps emerging institutions producing knowledge necessarily inclined towards an anthropocentric view of the planet. So I'm really curious, how did you get from Roger Bacon to this topic?
Yes. Well, I've been pondering that question. So I think that the thing that got me interested in Roger Bacon in the first place is that I was interested in how people thought about things and how they thought about the planet. And initially, I was interested in geography and medieval ideas about who was living in different parts of the world. And so I suppose you could see a kind of environmental determinism there, which I think we may come back to as well. But I think particularly what sorts of choices are made in how to understand the world and how things are interpreted. So Bacon's a very good person to think with about that, because he was very keen on getting the proper methodology for understanding things. He thought it was absolutely imperative to understand the planet better than we do. And he was very interested in how things affected each other. So, I mean, it's not really in any way like a modern sense of an ecosystem, but his ideas about the multiplication of species think about how stars influence the earth below, and all the things of the earth influence each other according to their properties. And so nothing is without influence on other things. And so it's a very kind of complicated, entangled view of reality, which he made mathematically straightforward. But I suppose those are things that I could take on and keep thinking about. So I'm particularly interested in how and why people think badly about climate change, know it's happening, don't quite know what to do about it, don't accept that it's more rational to deal with that than to keep growing the economy. these sorts of questions are all about how people think, and they present themselves as science or as economics, and I suppose in that sense it's a continuation of the same sort of inquiry. But I mean, separately, I also felt for a long time that I wanted to make my research speak to climate and environmental issues, and I wasn't sure how. It's not immediately obvious what a medieval historian can do, but yeah. So I suppose eventually it seemed to me that there were really big questions to answer that we weren't even asking as a society about how we got here, that can't be answered if you're just working in the modern period, that go much further back in time. So that's the project.
Yes, and just to go back to how the 1950s and the nuclear testing is considered to be a sort of the moment of the beginning of the Anthropocene. How do you view the period known as the Middle Ages to fit into this development? I mean, would you be inclined to say that perhaps we should look much further back in history to the interventions of humans in non-human life and the planet?
I mean, I think that that's one possibility, looking further back at what humans are doing. But I think that because it's geologists and other people who are working with a particular kind of physical evidence, their markers are when it's happened. So people have got to the point where they think nuclear testing is the thing to do. How on earth do you get there? So I think that's why you need this much longer history. And I mean, even if you start in 1500 with the beginnings of European colonialism, which is another place where a lot of people might start looking for things like the Anthropocene, why would you do that? You know, you have to keep looking further and further back. And I have to say, I've ended up looking right back to the ancient states to try and make sense of how it is that this sense of how humans are supposed to live and operate has developed over time.
Yeah, so it's more about ideas about how we can be involved with the planet, and methodologies that have evolved from that, and looking at the history of that rather than the actual moment itself where you see this sort of shift to the Anthropocene. And that has a very long history that we need to understand much better.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So in your recent pioneering work, especially on the global Middle Ages and the supplementary of past and present in 2018, in which you wrote a fascinating article with Aztec specialist Caroline Dodds-Pennock, you posed the following question. I'd just like to put it to you. So what does it mean for societies to conceive of themselves globally in the medieval period? And rather than exploring processes of globalization as a quality of modernity, you propose to look at ideology and global natural phenomena such as the skies, the climate, and local conceptualizations and practices dealing with them. So how does this work in your view? And perhaps you could also say a little bit about what you did in your article with Caroline.
Surely. So I think one of the issues with the development of the field of the global Middle Ages is because we felt, and there are various other projects in different countries, but this was the one that I was involved in, we felt that global history was treated as a thing that couldn't happen until Columbus. And before that, the world was not global because it was not connected by humans engaging in commercial activity that was traceable in the human record. And that seemed both a very limited way of thinking about what the globe might be as a historical object. But it also it makes the globe a kind of Eurocentric enterprise, and it's a very selective pair of continents that need to be connected, because obviously if you're starting global history in 1500, Australia's dispensable from the picture. And of course it makes it about European achievements. So it creates a sense of the global that is utterly locked into modern, rather vainglorious projects of a kind of westernized modernity that operates in kind of global capitalist terms. And it's very hard to see anything else if you start in 1500. So it was quite important to start earlier, but then you have to think creatively if you're starting earlier, because Columbus hasn't done his thing. And of course, there's increasing bits of evidence that other people did make that crossing at different points in time, but I'm not sure that necessarily helps either. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, I mean, partly you can take an environmental history approach to this and think, well, birds migrated and all sorts of other living things connected the globe, plus also weather systems and so on. But we're also thinking in a slightly different way about, so part of the thing of thinking in global terms is it is an act of the imagination. I mean, no one knows everything that's happening on the globe. Even big institutions that claim to represent the globe don't do it with one intelligence. It's got to be a lot of different perspectives put together, and bits are included unevenly. And so it's already an ideology rather than or an ideal at least, rather than a practice. So we started thinking, Caroline and I, about societies that were quite confident in themselves as global societies, and their way of understanding everything was total. So they knew what was on the planet, and they knew what mattered about it, and they acted and governed and created societies accordingly. So the idea of a globalizing cosmology that we proposed essentially is a cosmology that doesn't say, oh, there's lots of things we don't know, so therefore our idea of the world is partial, but says the profound meaning of the world, in the case of the Western Europeans, is that there's one God, and all people in the world, whether they know this God or not, are under the jurisdiction of this God, and here is its church. And you should go out and tell more people about it if you can. But that doesn't change anything, whether they know about it. This is still the whole truth for the whole planet. And as soon as you've got something like that, it doesn't really matter whether you know what's where. Mm-hmm. And that's much more important. And I think we would argue that it remains culturally much more important to say this is the meaning of, this is the trajectory humans are on, this is what it means. Those people might not have caught up with it yet, they might be a bit backwards, but they are developing nations, so they will one day share our universal truth.
Yes. Yeah.
So we felt in a way that was almost a more important quality of how things work than the knowing of every bit of the globe.
Yes. Yeah. And I was really particularly struck by your suggestion to overwrite the current periodization with climatic regimes, but not in the spirit of determinism, which is a question that always crops up, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, the environmental determinism, but to test correlations between these regimes experienced differently across the globe, and specificities of human adaptation until changes become anthropogenic in their causes. Because we can look at all kinds of entanglements between human and planetary life, between, interactions between the heavens, oceans, relationships with water, landscapes, human and non-human animal life. And I'm really struck, and it's something that I've been, considering, especially in recent years, but why is it that we have done so little? It's astounding, really, how little research has been done on these entanglements of human and non-human life, especially for the period known as the Middle Ages. So there's the book by Richard Hoffman, which I really enjoyed reading about environmental history, and Bruce Campbell, who did work on climate and the plague. But beyond that, I'm really struggling to find a sort of field in which this has been explored. Do you have an explanation for why this is this huge black hole?
I feel that it's a hole that's beginning to not be filled, but be worked in. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's beginning to change is to think in interdisciplinary terms as historians, and there's been a lot of toing and froing about that, and people are, what does it mean if you need to have a biologist to hand to be able to understand the insect that you wanted to study in the past, or a botanist for the plant, and then you can work with it historically, but you can't just do it on your own expertise in your own kind of space as an academic. So these sorts of interdisciplinary entanglements are something that you need, I think, probably to get at the historical entanglements, but how to do that, and I think it's needed to be worked out, and what the precise balance of authority in those relationships would be. I think there has been some anxiety amongst historians that they would become junior partners, and the scientists would know, they would say what's going on, and the historian could say, oh yes, we have a source that confirms that. And there's been good writing and thinking on that, and I think we're moving past that period of anxiety. But I think quite separately, there is quite a lot of specific studies on animal history, and I know that work on bees is on its way, and there's Jamie Craner's wonderful book on pigs. So that there is work, but I wonder whether to be able to produce a work like Hoffman's work, you need to have that there done, and then you can start surveying it and imagining a different world out of it. But I think it takes quite a lot of small separate shifts within history. But I think I don't know how serious I am in suggesting that we should have climatic regimes instead of periodization, but I think it's maybe a useful working solution. So what I'm talking about there is the the big solar cycles. So we have a Roman climate optimum where it's broadly warmer and easier. Then we have a late antique little ice age, and then we have a medieval climate anomaly where the conditions again improve. Then we have a little ice age and sort of shifts in between, and the modern warming that's anthropogenic. But if you've got these and they're being governed by the sun, in a sense that puts us back into a much earlier way of seeing the world, and it utterly succeeds in the provincializing Europe problem. You don't have to provincialize anything from anywhere. It's just planetary to start with. And so it gets rid of a lot of the sort of politics around how you do that.
And it was so important to people at that time, on a daily basis. And there are so many sources also produced on, how to deal with planetary impacts and what the sun is doing and what and I think we've also sort of slightly overlooked this whole dimension of life in that period. So even in that sense, I think there's still a lot of ground, and it's often sort of viewed as it's non-institutional knowledge, or it's sort of slightly superstitious knowledge or pagan knowledge. So in that sense, it's also been sort of pushed to one side to a certain extent. So it would be fantastic also for that reason to sort of bring it to the foreground again. So one of the critiques that sort of immediately always comes up when doing environmental history and when looking at, for instance, climate is that, there is this danger, are we not going back to environmental determinism? And this is a field that I'm sort of rather familiar with because of work I did in the past on constructions of ethnicity. And you see that these ideas from Aristotle and Hippocrates on the constitutions of people, constructing constitutions of people based on climate and used as a justification for a lot of inequalities are very popular throughout, from the 12th century certainly, and not only in the Latin world but also in the Arab and Greek traditions. And climate theory itself was also embedded in moral, religious civilization narratives, tying climate to progress, development, but also to, for instance, to original sin, and the whole idea that in Eden you have a perfect climate where there is no disease and no corruption, and then as soon as Adam and Eve get kicked out, then it all sort of begins to the meltdown. And also the history of environmental determinism sort of slips into racial capitalism, a system which derives unequal social and economic value from different groups. So I was wondering, rather than that we just continue to issue this warning about the dangers of environmental determinism, because I don't think people understand that this theory that it's actually quite dangerous, but rather to actually centre the history of environmental determinism to better understand the histories of the Anthropocene. And I was wondering your thoughts on, did environmental determinism, which claims to talk about environment, but very much from a perspective of organising labour, organising extraction of human life and non-human life, did it sort of create a sort of smoke screen, whereas it's seemingly talking about climate and environment, but it's actually doing something very different, which has subsequently meant that we're not talking about environment in the 20th century and early 21st century until, now that it's becoming part of the central agenda again. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the whole history of environmental determinism. Sorry to put this huge question to you.
I think that's a very interesting and quite important way of looking at it, actually, as a smokescreen. You can see a kind of environmental determinism in the way people think about climate change. It's going to affect the global south first. Do we really care about the global south? Maybe those parts of the world were always destined to be subject to drought and to famine and to flooding, and what can you do? And that's I suspect that's not just a narrative that would be coming from particular political quarters, but I fear that it underlies the way that very many people in the global north are thinking about this problem, or the kind of the quiet reassurance that they give themselves that they would never ever put like that explicitly. We act as if there are parts of the world that are dispensable, and people who live in them who are dispensable. And I feel there's a kind of environmental determinism there. but I think what historians can do, I think this is why I think historians should really urgently become involved in these kinds of conversations. And I think one of the things that history can do, if you're a young person today, I think that you can chart the years of your life against, the hockey stick graph or any of these other very disturbing charts of rising temperatures. And of course they vary a bit depending on what action's taken, but they're all going up. And they're terrifying. And if you would under ordinary circumstances expect to live to near the end of this century, there is a kind of really eerie determinism in those charts for your life. I think for older people, that's what's going to happen afterwards. So it's got a different kind of type of resonance. But if your life goes against it, it's marked out against it, then, that's about as deterministic as it can be in a way. And there's very little space is being created to think, yes, the temperatures are going up, but what does that actually mean for societies? And what historians can do very powerfully, I think, is to show that there's absolutely no connection really between environmental change and necessary consequences for human societies, that there are always choices, and one choice leads to another choice, and you can have the bleakest dystopian future that you can imagine, but you can fight hard for other things, but you have to know it's possible. So I think what historians can actually do is identify what determinism's done over the centuries and deny the possibility that determinism will really affect outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Yeah. And I was wondering to what extent today's institutions, which are themselves, and we're here at the University of Leiden, next to a Hortus Botanicus, which was first constructed around 1600, taking plants from all over the world, bringing them here, and then researching them as part of the development of the university as an institute. So, to what extent universities as institutions are the ideal places to begin to come up with different narratives about climate and environmental determinism? Are we, in any sense, do we have to perhaps also break away from our own past as universities that are also embedded in all kinds of colonial networks, and the collections that we have and the ideas that we've produced over the last so if we begin at like 1200, so 800 years, how can we step back from that perhaps, and is that necessary to be able to come up with different narratives?
Yes, these are incredibly important questions for us all to be asking. I think, one of the ironies, if irony is the right word for it, is the way that university or academic researchers in general have slowly and painfully discovered things that Indigenous people have known all along, or some groups of Indigenous people have known all along. So if you have plant scientists and people working with trees painfully discovering that they act with intelligence, might not be the right word, but intention and responsiveness and connectedness, and there's a lot of fascinating research showing that just very recently. But there were people who always thought that. They might not have put it in the same terms, but so we had a long period of choosing particular sorts of ignorance about the environment, so that, in order to facilitate extracting value from it, or particular kinds of value from it, without much regard for the environment itself. But there's a lot of work of unraveling things that we understood, and there's clearly a lot of expertise that lies far beyond the university and its sort of stamp of intellectual authority that could be drawn on, and is beginning to be drawn on. You do see conversations with Indigenous researchers or Indigenous Indigenous people being brought into some of the very big international reports. Actually, particularly the biodiversity one has a section which is called Indigenous Knowledge, which is taken seriously at last. But it's not even. I guess the categories of Indigenous relates to colonialism, but there are other people who know things, who are maybe not colonized by Europeans but have been hugely disadvantaged by global capitalism, who also, how do you bring the voices of very, very poor people whose experiences are right in the forefront of climate change? How do you bring... Yes. And I think a question that interests me a lot, that's a big and difficult one there, if you're bringing a peasant from an area that's been kind of grotesquely affected to talk are you only going to allow them to talk about where they come from and what they know, or are you going to allow them to make universal pronouncements of the kind we make in the universities? So are there other kinds of knowledge being too contained in boxes and not able to speak in ways that might be helpful for us to hear? So I think that, people are working on this, and there are really interesting books about it, but it's a relatively limited line of inquiry within the university.
Yeah. So, huge question: how, in your opinion, can historical narratives help when we're facing these large current crises?
Yes, a large question. I think that there's a lot of talk of solutions, and there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that things must happen fast, and they're not happening fast. And yet we have all these excellent solutions, so why isn't it happening? And I often feel that scientists and well-intentioned policymakers are a bit baffled about why it's not happening, and then they tend to look for sort of immediate political explanations and organizations that might be opposing action. And of course there is all that going on. But if we're thinking about the rest of the population, does the rest of the population have a way of thinking productively about it? I think the majority of people probably accept that something's happening now, and those who don't maybe do accept it really, or fear it and don't want to think about it. So there's all that going on. But if you're not a scientific expert, how do you think about this? It's something the scientists are saying is happening. How do you make that part of your life? Your life seems to be quite normal mostly. So that's the area where I think humanities people are really missing in these conversations. So if we tell a history that shows how we got here from a long, long series of attitudes and ambitions and ways of valuing and the sorts of things that we have valued, the kinds of costs we thought it was worth paying for those values, how most people have been taught that they work hard to produce surpluses that they may not ever control themselves, that fund elite lifestyles. If we can see that going back as far as you like, which historians are working on all sorts of pieces of this picture, then that's a very different history from the kind of history that's taught in schools. But supposing people could see what was happening now as an outcome of a whole set of ways of thinking that weren't necessary ways of thinking, and could see maybe alternative ways of doing things that have only recently been lost, or perhaps still persist in maybe damaged but maybe recoverable forms, I feel as if then there's something that you can take hold of and own, whereas at the moment people are given perhaps nationalist narratives or
capitalist narrative.
Exactly. Yeah. And those are the ways they're taught to think and value. And if you're in one of those progress capitalist narratives where everything's going to get better and it will get better when the market grows, how can you think about this? You can't think about it. You don't have the tools to think about it.
Yeah.
So it's just something else that the experts are telling you about. Whereas I think humanities people can come into the heart of things, and not just history but literature and music and all the different disciplines. We've been thinking about this in some other work that I've been doing. How can we help people build an imaginative enthusiasm for tackling these questions in ways that are good and get us away from the determinism of the dystopian burning planet future.
I was also thinking it's sort of a history of the concept of growth from all kinds of different perspectives might also help people to imagine, because growth in terms of economic growth is considered a sort of a natural phenomena, whereas we can place huge questions behind that. But it's very interesting how this sort of naturalized metaphor has been encapsulated in economic terms, whereas growth on the planet at the same time has been destructed.
But also, the growth of forests is somehow seen as unnatural.
Yes. So I would like to end with a wonderful quote from your own work. Historians need epistemologies that acknowledge the deficit. Could you explain to us what you meant by that?
So I suppose what I was suggesting there is something that I suppose I do it with a lot of my students when they're writing essay questions, and I need the familiar topics, why was this emperor so successful? Successful for whom, I always suggest they ask, and at what cost, and what are the consequences, and what are all the consequences of this successful policy that you've identified as, this strong emperor's ruling effectively, but what happened all around that, who benefited from that strong emperor ruling, what were people told was the benefit of that, security and peace within the empire, perhaps. But the more that you sort of probe into this and you think about, he's issued coinage, excellent, that's a sign of stability, but when the coin, it's metals, it has to be extracted from the ground and smelted. There's these quite disturbing recent studies with ice core samples that show that the levels of lead pollution in Europe have been continuously high since the Roman period, except during the Black Death, when they dropped down to what might be considered a baseline level. So all this time we've been breathing, and I mean, until it was sort of recognised, and lead pollution was sort of, has dropped a bit since then. But there are a lot of other consequences that you don't see. So the issuing of coinage we tend to value as stability, and yet what about the mountains that are being broken up? What about the rivers that are full of the pollutions from the smelting process? What about the people who inhale the fumes as they smelt? Yeah. And that's just one example. You can, if they build a great navy, where are the forests? So those kinds of deficits. If you've got a beautiful ivory medieval object, what about the body of the elephant or the walrus where the ivories come from? Exactly. Yeah. And we never see the deficit. No. And it sounds like I'm proposing a very grim and melancholy kind of history. And in a way, I suppose I am, but without that, I think we just make invisible the things that we need to see. So then we remove choices from ourselves because we don't recognise the deficit. So I think that's what I'm suggesting historians could focus on as at least an intermediate step towards developing that sort of recognition.
Thank you very much, Amanda. It was wonderful to talk to you today, and I think you're raising so interesting and very important questions, which I'm sure will unfortunately also be on the agenda for the coming decades. So thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for inviting me.